All right, to me, it is August something, and you are starting student teaching in about 2 days. In the meantime, you've also just finished Kurt Vonnegut's Slapstick. Um, this is a book that's really interesting for you personally, just because you read this I've read this quite a bit in high school. I think I read it 3 or 4 times. And I certainly didn't get the full picture of it until rereading it this time. And a lot of it comes from, I think, just like not fully appreciating or fully putting together some of the uses of science fiction, and how that can all be applied within the way a story is written and things like that. So that's that. Also, there's a huge portion to understanding this book is based in understanding the prologue, which is Kurt Vonnegut explaining the process of how he came to write this book in the first place. And it kind of comes down to these two main key components of, he is writing it for his sister. His sister had passed away quite a few years before that, and Kurt mentions in this prologue that like his sister is the reason that he has always written, and this is kind of like the last kind of big thing dedicated to her, as far as I understand, in his writing of the prologue. And then the second portion of it is the connection in which he and his sister and his family like would watch slapstick comedies together, and like just the concept of slapstick humor, and using that to write, right? So if you go into reading this with those kind of two key components in mind, in which you have to view this as some sort of slapstick humor style comedy, but then also view it as like a great homage to familyhood and what it means to be a family and things like that, right? I think in general I just get a lot more out of this. Also combined with the idea that science fiction is in a lot of ways used to be a look into the real world without having to express the real world or represent some of the ideas, right? I talked a little bit with the Martian Chronicles, right, where we're allowed to represent kind of the major facets or the most important facets of certain idealizations, right? And so if you take all those three kind of points into really understanding this book, I think I got a lot from it this time. And then also just some other things that are sprinkled around through there, right? The two, well, in terms of the slapstick comedy, right? So I guess I'll start there, is this kind of idea in which like the slapstick humor itself comes from this idea that like increasingly odd and incredibly situational, ironic ways of humor, or jokes, usually in physical comedy, to come about. And we get this kind of slapstick kind of humor from the physical necessity of needing Wilbur and Eliza to have to be physically touching in order for their minds to work at their full capacity, right? But when they're separated, all of a sudden they become relatively normal intelligence, right? But then also, while they're initially in the mansion that they're initially set up in, is that they pretend to be much dumber than they actually are, pretending to only be 2 or 3 years mentally, because that is what they think is expected of them. So you have this kind of weird slapstick humor in which they are pretending to be, they are smart enough to fully understand that this is what they're expected to be, but not understand that that's not what was actually wanted from them. That's what was expected, not wanted of them. But then also the way in which, like, we have to get the physical description of, they eventually have to take intelligence tests, and initially they're forced to take them apart, which I'll get to in a second, and they perform poorly, and then they're allowed to take it together, and they get all the questions right, but they are so, like, grossly entangled with each other, and so physically reliant on each other that it is disturbing and disgusting to everyone else that has to watch them, right? But the reason this happens is because of the science fiction portion of this, which is the comments on, like, American so valuing certain, and so predicated and so desiring of certain values. If we're like this constant idea of pull your bootstraps, this is America, you make it on your own kind of deal. And what we saw was, well, when these two people are forced to do things on their own, right? I should say this, right? Is that we've just get to the point where they have to where they're administering these tests. They're being administered by someone who really, really hates rich kids, thinks that their job is a joke, that they're doing such menial work for someone who's incredibly smart, and is someone that, like, she is someone who fulfilled the American dream, where like she, was able to work from the bottom up and became a doctor. And so, like, she has this very, 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 very singular focus of, you have to do things on your own, you're on your own, you do it yourself. And then what we see is that Eliza and Wilbur are both completely average when they're forced to be by themselves, but when they are allowed to work together, they score perfectly. But by allowing the two of them to work together, it's inherently against American values and American idealism. The great slapstick humor in that is that we have this weird juxtaposition of what is happening in China, and what's happening in China at this point is that they're realizing, in the science fiction realm, is that they can put groups of like-minded people together to basically create super brains. And instead of forcing one person to think for one person, you're allowing 5 people to think for one person, and you're creating a much smarter civilization out of that, right? And so, like, we get this constant kind of juxtaposition of what's China doing, and as it turns out, they're doing the exact opposite thing. The very slapstick humor of what they're doing is the exact opposite of what America is doing, but America is so assured of themselves that they refuse to change, right? So yeah, that was probably a really convoluted way to explain that. I'm sorry, future me. But yeah. And then also combined with that, right, is that we get this whole idea of, like, the concept of telepathically communicating with like-minded beings and being able to work with them very closely and creating small units that think as a single entity, right? And become much smarter because they're working together, right? And it is the inherent American value system to say that is absolutely horrendous, that's terrible, we should never do that, everyone's on your own. But then we actually get the Americanized version of this concept, which is that Wilbur, who eventually becomes the last official president of the United States, he proposes a concept in which everyone around the country gets randomly generated a new middle name that is like some sort of like natural thing, and then a number 1 through 20, and anyone else that has the same name as you is your cousin, but if they have the same name and same number, they are your brother or your sister or your sibling, right? And so it's this general concept of like, and what happens then in that case is that everyone gets assigned these numbers, and then they start forming their groups on their own, right? They start forming huge communities on their own in which like they have not been forced, but they have been encouraged to get together and work together based on these randomly assigned names. And right, we get this constant idealism of like people around the country that haven't flocked to these certain communities are then there to constantly help each other with the same middle name or the same number, the same, you know, brother, sister, sibling, or cousin. And that's how you help each other, right? Because the American value system is inherently based on family, right? If you assign it as a family, all of a sudden it becomes a very Americanized ideal and people go along with it. But when it is a think group and you're learning to telepathically communicate with each other, and it's not a family thing, it's a think group, well, all of a sudden it's foreign and we don't like it. But as soon as it's proposed in a concept of family units, and the idea that no matter where you went in the world, or no matter where you went in the United States, there would always be family around, well, all of a sudden it's really interesting and it's really important to people, which is like one of those kind of like slapstick kind of humor things of like, oh, we just repackaged it, the same exact idea, we just repackaged it and sold it to you differently, and all of a sudden you loved it, right? But yeah, right. And then we get to the kind of final thing, which the final chapter is a really cool kind of like full physical representation of this, which is that Wilbur, who is now living in Manhattan, which is effectively abandoned except for a very, very small group of people, at one point traveled, had a son, went back to Manhattan, or then moved to Manhattan, and then that son had a daughter. That daughter was then forced into effectively sex work, and the daughter at the age of 14 was able to then travel across the country based on the system of family members that have been randomly assigned to get to her grandfather, who is Wilbur, right? Because at this point in the timeline, the country's fallen apart. The country no longer exists. It is just a whole bunch of families running things effectively, right? But like, it's just one of those things where like, once again, you get to this idea of, right, of where like, if we were to visualize American idealism, it is inherently the family unit. That is one of the most key points to American idealism, and the idea that you can have family anywhere in the country, no matter where you are, no matter who you are, you can have access to family, then all of a sudden becomes super, super, super important. And and we transcend what is traditional American value systems to new age American value systems, right? Which I think is a really interesting thing. It's really kind of fascinating idea. But yeah. Book itself, on how it's written, it's written in a really interesting way, in which it's a lot of very, very short chapters. It's like, I think it's like 200 something pages, and it's like 40 chapters or 50 chapters even. So it's just a lot of very, very short chapters, and each one of those is very much segmented into constant little thoughts. So like at most you're reading a page at a time, and then it might be in the same chapter, but then all of a sudden it's a different thought that's connected to this somehow. So it is really just a really interesting way to set up chapters. And then also, it's not in chronological order. We kind of bounce between a couple different timelines. We bounce between Wilbur growing up, Wilbur and Eliza growing up and living in the mansion, and their initial, movement from pretending to be 2 and 3 years old to showing their intellect. And then we get this kind of bounce back and forth between Wilbur at his current state of age, in which he is turning 101 and he is very close to death. He has managed to not die from the Green Death yet. But then also we then get kind of bounce back between Wilbur's general progression through life, right? So yeah, that's just another really interesting way, because we get this kind of constant bouncing back and forth. But yeah, that is Slapstick. Kurt Vonnegut's Slapstick. It's a lot of talk about Indianapolis, which is fun. But yeah.